The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. In the summer of 1769, on a rocky island off the coast of Italy that had just fallen into French hands, a boy was born who would one day shake the foundations of Europe. Corsica was his home, wild, proud, rebellious. The French called it theirs, but the Corsicans didn't agree. Among them was a fiercely nationalistic family bearing the name Bonaparte. And on August 15th of that year, a screaming infant named Napoleon Bonaparte came into the world. He was not born into riches. His family was minor nobility, yes, but their status meant little without wealth. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer who navigated Corsican politics with cautious ambition. His mother, Letizia, was strong, strict, and commanding, a woman who bore 13 children and expected discipline from every one of them. From her, Napoleon inherited resilience. From his father, perhaps, came a thirst for respect. As a child, Napoleon wasn't particularly sociable. He was serious, brooding. He preferred solitude, books, and thoughts of war. While other boys played games, Napoleon imagined armies marching. He studied maps like they were treasure chests, and when he did play, it wasn't for fun, it was to win. When he was just 9 years old, his father secured him a scholarship to a French military academy in mainland France. It was an enormous opportunity, but it came with a price. Corsicans were seen as backwater provincials. Napoleon spoke French with a thick accent. His classmates mocked him. They called him names. They laughed at his strange, intense stare. But if Napoleon hurt, he didn't show it. He swallowed every insult like fuel. He immersed himself in his studies, especially mathematics, history, and, of course, military strategy. By the time he was a teenager, he was already reading about Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, not just as history, but as destiny. He wanted to follow their footsteps, or better yet, surpass them. His brilliance didn't go unnoticed. At just 16, Napoleon became a second lieutenant in the French artillery. The world outside the academy was changing fast. France was heading toward revolution. The old monarchy was crumbling, and the streets of Paris were boiling with rage. While the nobility feared what was coming, Napoleon sensed opportunity. In 1789, the French Revolution exploded. Heads rolled. A king was executed. A queen followed. The old world was gone in a blink. And for a young man like Napoleon, who had neither great wealth nor connections but possessed an unshakable mind, this was a door kicked open. He began writing political essays. He argued passionately for Corsican independence, aligning himself with revolutionary ideals. But he soon found himself at odds with the very Corsican leaders he once admired. Pascal Paoli, Corsica's own revolutionary hero, eventually turned against him. Napoleon and his entire family were forced to flee Corsica. They returned to France in disgrace, nearly destitute. But France was a land of chaos, and in chaos Napoleon thrived. He rejoined the French army, and in 1793, at just 24 years old, he got his first real chance. The port city of Toulon had been seized by royalists and was being held with the help of British forces. France needed to reclaim it, but the siege dragged on. Then Napoleon, a young artillery captain, presented a bold plan. He didn't just want to attack. He wanted to position artillery on the surrounding hills, turning the British ships in the harbor into sitting ducks. His superiors were skeptical, but desperate, they gave him a chance. His strategy worked. The British fleet withdrew. The royalists surrendered. Toulon was retaken. The young artillery captain from Corsica became a national hero. The leaders of the revolution took notice. In just a matter of months, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. But France wasn't done bleeding. In 1795, Royalists staged another uprising in Paris. They marched with the goal of toppling the revolutionary government. The streets were ready to burn. Once again, the government turned to Napoleon. He didn't hesitate. He ordered his men to fire cannon into the mob. Grape shot, a brutal hail of metal that shredded the crowds. It wasn't mercy, it was control. The revolt was crushed in minutes. Paris was silent. The event would later be remembered as the whiff of grape shot. It saved the Republic, and it launched Napoleon's career into the stratosphere. At just 26, Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the most powerful men in France. He had no title of nobility, no great inheritance, no elite name. What he had was something far more dangerous. Vision, brilliance, and a mind that refused to accept limits. He was a Corsican outsider, no more. France had become his playground, and the world had no idea what was coming. When Napoleon Bonaparte married Josephine de Beauharnais in March 1796, it wasn't just a love story, it was a gamble. She was 6 years older, elegant, connected to Parisian high society, and once the mistress of powerful men. Napoleon, by contrast, was still the young general from Corsica who wrote her desperate letters filled with longing. She called him her little man, perhaps affectionately, perhaps condescendingly. But just 2 days after their wedding, he was gone. The French Republic had entrusted him with the command of the Army of Italy, a position meant more as a formality than faith. The army was starving, disorganized, and demoralized. It was seen as a sideshow. No one expected miracles. Then Napoleon showed up. He wasn't tall, but he had presence. He walked into the army camp like he belonged there, not with bluster, but with purpose. He spoke to the soldiers like they were equals, not pawns. "Soldiers," he told them, "you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. You will find honor, glory, and riches." That was all they needed. Over the next year, Napoleon led his ragtag army through the Alps and into northern Italy with breathtaking speed and genius. He defeated Austria's allies at Montenotte, Lodi, and Arcole. His enemies were more experienced, more numerous, but he moved like lightning, outthinking and outmaneuvering them at every turn. He didn't just win battles, he made legends. At the Battle of Lodi, his troops hesitated to cross a narrow bridge under heavy fire. Napoleon didn't bark orders. He grabbed a flag, charged across the bridge himself, and dared them to follow. They did, and they won. From that day forward, his men began to believe in something dangerous, that Napoleon could not be defeated. Meanwhile, back in France, the people adored him. Newspapers printed heroic accounts of his victories, many written by Napoleon himself. He was not just a general, he was crafting his image like an artist. His dispatches described glory, honor, and purpose. He made war sound noble, and the people ate it up. The Italian campaign culminated in the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797. Austria had been humbled. France gained territory, and Napoleon returned home a superstar. He was barely 28 years old, but his fame made some politicians nervous. A young general beloved by his troops and adored by the people? That sounded more like a threat than a hero. So, in 1798, they sent him far from Europe to Egypt. It was a strange decision. France wanted to threaten British trade routes to India by taking control of Egypt. But the campaign was as much political exile as military strategy. Once again, Napoleon saw opportunity where others saw exile. He landed in Alexandria and marched his troops toward Cairo, facing brutal heat and unfamiliar terrain. Then came the Battle of the Pyramids. Facing Mamluk cavalry with modern French formations, Napoleon crushed the enemy. He told his men, "Soldiers, from the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries looked down upon you." It was pure theater, and it worked. But victory on land didn't mean safety. The British, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, destroyed Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Now, Napoleon was stranded in Egypt with no way to return. Still, he made the most of it. He brought scientists, artists, and scholars with him, launching a cultural expedition alongside the military one. It was during this time that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, a key to unlocking ancient Egyptian writing. Napoleon didn't just want to conquer. He wanted to be remembered as a bringer of civilization. But events in France drew his attention. The government, the Directory, was corrupt and collapsing. The revolution had devoured itself. The people were disillusioned. The time was ripe. In August 1799, Napoleon slipped past the British blockade and returned to France. The country was shocked, but also thrilled. He was welcomed not as a fugitive, but as a savior. And that's exactly how he saw himself. In November of that year, he staged a coup d'état known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. With a mix of political cunning and military intimidation, he overthrew the Directory and created a new government. He was now first consul of France. At just 30 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte had gone from Corsican outcast to the most powerful man in France. He had crushed enemies in battle, seduced the public with his words, and outplayed rivals in politics. But he was not done. This was not the end of his rise. It was only the beginning. When Napoleon became first consul of France in 1799, he was still pretending to be just another servant of the Republic. But behind the scenes, the Republic was already dead, and he was the one tightening the noose. He moved quickly like he always did. In 1800, he crossed the Alps in a dramatic campaign to defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. The crossing itself was legendary. Napoleon on a rearing white horse, cloak billowing behind him. A moment later immortalized in countless paintings. But the truth? He actually crossed the Alps on a mule. Still, the myth mattered more than the mule. And once again, he won. Victory at Marengo cemented his power. By 1802, he had made peace with Britain and the rest of Europe for now. At home, he passed sweeping reforms. New schools, tax systems, civil codes. He created the Bank of France. He centralized government and curbed corruption. The people, weary from a decade of chaos, finally felt stability. But that stability came with a trade-off: freedom for order. In 1804, he dropped the pretense. The Senate declared him Emperor of the French, and in a ceremony dripping with symbolism, he walked into the Notre Dame Cathedral with the Pope standing by, then crowned himself. It was the ultimate statement. He did not kneel. No church, no noble lineage, no God above would place that crown on his head. He had earned it. Europe watched in horror. Monarchs saw not just a former revolutionary, but a new kind of king. One born not from blood, but from brilliance. That made him even more dangerous. They formed a new coalition: Britain, Austria, Russia, and others intent on stopping this self-made emperor. Napoleon answered in the only way he knew how, with war. In 1805, he faced them in a campaign that would produce one of his greatest masterpieces, the Battle of Austerlitz. He baited the Allied forces by pretending to be weak. He allowed them to think they could break his army, and when they attacked, he snapped the trap shut. His flanks crushed the Austro-Russian troops. His center held strong. By day's end, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers were dead or captured. It became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, and Napoleon was the only one left standing tall. It was brilliance. It was art. It was devastating. The Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 years old, was dissolved shortly after. Europe bent to Napoleon's will. He redrew borders, placed family members on thrones, and enforced the Napoleonic Code across the lands. His legal reforms touched Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. French became the language of the elite. His vision of order and meritocracy began replacing old aristocracies. But he also became more ruthless. He censored the press, jailed dissenters, and treated conquered lands as tools. He believed in equality so long as he was at the top. In 1806, he crushed Prussia at Jena Auerstedt. In 1807, he humbled Russia at Friedland, leading to the Treaty of Tilsit. There, on a raft in the middle of the Neman River, he met with Tsar Alexander I. The two men, one born to rule, the other who seized it, shook hands and carved up Europe like bread. For a moment, peace. But peace with Napoleon never lasted long. His obsession with Britain, his eternal enemy, grew. Since he couldn't invade the island, he waged economic war instead. The continental system banned European nations from trading with Britain. But it hurt France's allies more than it hurt the British. Then came Spain. In 1808, Napoleon made a fatal mistake. He invaded Spain and put his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish people rose in revolt. The British sent troops. The war turned into a bloody, endless guerrilla conflict, the Peninsular War, draining French resources and morale. Even worse, the myth of Napoleon's invincibility began to crack. His marshals couldn't win without him. His enemies were learning. At home, he grew paranoid. He divorced Josephine in 1810, heartbroken, but determined to produce an heir. He married Marie-Louise of Austria, a teenage princess. The move shocked Europe. The revolutionary hero was now tied to old monarchy by marriage. In 1811, a son was born, Napoleon II. The empire seemed secure. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Russia, now resisting the continental system, was drifting away. Napoleon couldn't let that stand. And so, he began planning his boldest, most dangerous campaign yet, the invasion of Russia. He had conquered almost all of Europe. He had crowned himself emperor. But the greatest test of his power, the beginning of his downfall, was waiting in the cold lands to the east. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte ruled over the largest European empire since ancient Rome. He had bent kings to his will, redrawn borders, crowned himself emperor, and fathered a son who would inherit a throne carved from conquest. But something inside Napoleon had shifted. He was no longer the hungry Corsican upstart or the brilliant general inspiring starving troops. He was now a monarch himself, draped in silks, feared more than loved, and constantly watching his empire for cracks. And there was one place where the cracks were growing fast: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had once been Napoleon's partner, but the alliance was cold, uneasy. Russia refused to fully comply with the continental system. The economic blockade meant to cripple Britain. Trade flowed through Russian ports. Napoleon felt mocked, betrayed. So he did what he always did. He chose war. In June 1812, Napoleon gathered the Grande Army, over 600,000 soldiers, the largest military force Europe had ever seen. They came from France, Italy, Germany, Poland, Austria, even Spain. This was not just a French army. It was an empire on foot. He called it the Second Punic War, comparing himself to Hannibal. But unlike Hannibal, he wasn't just crossing mountains. He was walking into the heart of a continent-sized trap. The Russians didn't play by his rules. They didn't fight set-piece battles. They retreated again and again, burning their own villages and crops behind them. It was a tactic of exhaustion. Deny Napoleon food, shelter, and glory. Still, he pressed on. His army suffered from heat, dysentery, desertion, and endless marches. By September, they reached the gates of Moscow, only to find the city eerily empty. Then came the fire. The Russians had set it ablaze. Flames devoured the city. No food, no peace offering, no surrender. Just smoke. Napoleon waited in the ruins, hoping for a Tsar's letter. None came. Winter crept in. Supplies vanished. Horses starved. Soldiers froze in their boots. Still no word from Alexander. Napoleon had no choice. On October 19, 1812, he began the retreat. It was not a march, it was a massacre. Russian Cossacks stalked the rear. Wolves fed on the dying. Starvation, cold, and frostbite destroyed what the enemy had not. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée stumbled back across the Berezina River in November, fewer than 100,000 soldiers remained. Over 500,000 lives had been lost. It was one of the greatest military disasters in history, but Napoleon survived. That was always his curse. He survived when others died. In Paris, his enemies stirred. Sensing weakness, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Britain formed a new coalition. Napoleon returned to France and built a new army from boys, old men, and conscripts. And against all odds, he kept fighting. In 1813, he won battles at Lutzen and Bautzen, a ghost of his former brilliance flickering to life. But it wasn't enough. In October 1813 came the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. Nearly 600,000 troops clashed. Napoleon's army was outnumbered, surrounded, and eventually forced to retreat. It was the beginning of the end. By 1814, enemy troops marched into Paris. His marshals, once loyal, begged him to surrender. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated the throne. He kissed his son goodbye and was exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. It should have ended there. But Napoleon Bonaparte was never meant for quiet exile. In less than a year, he escaped. With just 1,000 men, he landed in southern France. The king sent troops to arrest him. But when they met Napoleon on the road, he stepped forward, opened his coat, and shouted, "If you would shoot your emperor, here I am." No one fired. They joined him.
France érupted.
Crowds chanted his name. The king fled. In a stunning return, Napoleon marched into Paris unopposed. The world was stunned. His return sparked the 100 Days, a frantic final chapter of power. But the Allies moved fast. Britain and Prussia mobilized. Then came Waterloo. June 18, 1815. Belgium. Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Blücher. For hours, the French fought valiantly, but a late Prussian arrival turned the tide. The battlefield turned to mud. French cavalry charges bogged down. Command errors piled up. Napoleon watched it all collapse. Defeated, he fled the field. Days later, he abdicated again. This time, there would be no second return. The British captured him and sent him far away, to the lonely island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, surrounded by nothing but ocean and guards, the emperor of half the world became a prisoner. He spent his final years writing, arguing with his jailers, walking the rocky cliffs, and reflecting on what he had built and destroyed. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died at the age of 51. His final words were whispered to no one in particular. France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. He had once commanded millions. He had shaped laws, toppled monarchs, redrawn continents. And in the end, he died alone. But his shadow never vanished. The roads of Europe still follow the lines he drew. The laws of nations still echo his reforms. And in the minds of men, Napoleon Bonaparte remains something more than just a man. He remains a storm. As history marched forward, the world would remember Waterloo, Austerlitz, and Moscow. They would remember the young Corsican who once dreamed of glory, who reached for the stars, touched them, and fell. And centuries later, when people speak of power, genius, and empire, they still speak his name. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful history like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share. Thank you.